Joe Keeton was born in 1920 in Derbyshire in the East Midlands of England. Keeton discovered his hypnotic abilities when very young, though he did not take them seriously until many years later. Over a period of 25 years, he had conducted 8,000 regressions. Joe Keeton passed away in 2003. The following hypnosis regression session took place between Joe Keeton and 60-year-old craft teacher by the name of Frances Isaacson. Whilst under hypnosis, Frances was asked the obvious first question, "Who are you?" and she replied, "Margaret." She was then asked how old she was and what year it was. She said she was 11 years old and the year was 1811. After further discussions, Joe found that the family's name was Benson, and so the child's full name was Margaret Benson. She said that her mother was deceased and her father was a merchant who sold dishes, pots, pans and yardage. Yardage is an old expression that is not used much today, and in this case it meant yardage material. After the session, Frances said she had never heard of the word in her life, but it was casually mentioned by young Margaret Benson. Margaret said that she lived in Grosvenor Square, Concord, New Hampshire, United States. She said she had a friend called Lucy McDougall. Her teacher's name was Mrs. Bartholomew. She said that most of the people she was connected with were involved in farming, but she also knew a place that made shoes. Margaret was then brought forward to the age of 21, where the tone of her voice totally changed. She was asked where she was, and she replied that she was in church and was wearing a white dress as she was preparing to get married. They asked her the name of the groom, and she replied, "Richard Smith," but then said spelt with a Y. They asked her whether she'd been doing anything interesting recently, and she said putting up fruit. She was asked what her husband did. Her face then took on a smug and conceited expression and said, "He is a doctor." They asked her where her husband qualified, and she replied, "Reed College. I think it's in Canada." Actually, Reed College was in Portland. From that moment on, Margaret's life took on a pattern in life that was consistent with many regressions, such as the normal, mundane and trivial activities, rather than anything exciting or traumatic. She would describe the colour of a dress, bottling fruit, as sitting in a rocking chair and dusting. Margaret was recalling many of the dreariest aspects of life that most people would have encountered. She said she had 4 children, where one had died. When they progressed Margaret's life to the age of 31, they found her life was in a bit of a rut. She now lived in Oak Lane, Concord, and had 3 children. To buy a dress would cost about $5, but her housekeeper made her dresses for her. They asked her about any news of the day. She said that many men were going west to find vacant land. She had no idea who her husband's patients were, but many of his patients came in after being kicked by their horses, as she did not help in the dispensary. Her husband calls it his laboratory. She did name some of the medicines, such as yellow-brown mixture for stomach upsets, which was probably kaolin opium, iodine for cuts, and Epsom salts for unspecified ailments. At the age of 40, they found her to be weary and sitting in a rocking chair. She would regularly sigh and appear to be disillusioned with marriage. When they asked her questions about her current life, she replied with, "Utterly weary and fed up and still in the same house." She complained of too much work, and her husband was always busy. Although she still had servants, the children made her tired. After progressing to the age of 60, her responses appeared to be livelier than at any other time in her life. They asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Dusting." They asked her whether she was in good health, and she replied that she had lost her teeth. They asked her who the president was, and she said, "Lincoln." They asked her whether she voted for him, but she said she could not vote. Women did not get the vote until 1920, but only for white women. She said he was going to free the black man, but her husband did not approve of that because there would not be enough work for them. When they progressed her to the age of 67, she said that her husband had been dead for a year, but she showed no emotion. He had been buried at the local church that had a white steeple and was located just off the Commons. When they progressed her to the final moments in her life, her voice sounded old and frail. She said she was 89, and they asked her whether she was afraid. She said she was not able to breathe, then said, "I can't let go, I can't let go." Frances' head then tilted to one side, obviously showing that Margaret had now passed away. Keeton then asked Frances to go 5 years into the future, and immediately her voice changed from a frail woman to a childish voice. He asked her where she was now, and Frances said she was living in the United States. He asked her what her name was and how old she was. She replied the name was Randolph and he was 5, so in this life Frances was now a male. He asked where in the United States he was living, and he said Virginia, and he lived on a farm. It was a white house with a fence around it. He was asked whether he had any toys, and he said a hammer. Were there any animals around? And he said a big horse. He stands there and I brush him. He has progressed to the age of 15 and goes by the name of Randy, and that his surname is Nelson. He claims to have been born in 1890 and was presently attending a military college by the name of Briarcliff. He said he hates the school and the teachers and was not cut out to be a soldier. Records showed that there was a military college in Briarcliff Manor, New York, called Holbrook's Military Academy, and also known as Dr. Holbrook's Military School. At the age of 20, Randolph is back on the farm and riding a horse. Frances claimed to have no interest in horses, yet Randolph's interest in horses dominated his life and is discussed in most parts of the regression. He was asked about the farm, and he said they bred horses, hay, and grew tobacco. The tobacco was sold in Richmond. He was asked the name of the auctioneer, and he said Bressler. He was asked about any statues in Richmond. He said there was the statue of General Washington in the square. There is a statue called the Virginia Washington Monument, known locally simply as the Washington Monument. It is a 19th century neoclassical statue of George Washington located on the public square in Richmond, Virginia. Randy was progressed to the age of 27, where the year is 1917. He was asked if there was a war on, and he initially said no, but when asked again he said there was a war in Europe. America entered the war on April 6, 1917, and when he was brought forward 6 months, he said that he was now on a ship sailing to France. He was with the 67th Infantry, and its rank was First Lieutenant. His army number was 82003. He was asked the name of the commander, and he said Beetle. There was a Major General Biddle, who was acting Chief of Staff in 1917 to 1918 in France. Randy was brought forward another 6 months, where Frances was now slumped in the chair, and there was an expression of pain on her face, and her voice was weak. Randy is in hospital in France and was wounded in the leg. He was in a hospital in Loire, in Orleans, called Sacred Heart. His voice became weak and sounded distressed, and it is not known whether Randy survived the war. Unfortunately, service records of whether a Randolph Nelson had ever served were destroyed in a fire in 1973 in St. Louis, where they were housed. Frances was brought forward 5 years and was asked what her name was, and in a childish, perky voice said Frances. It appears that Frances Isaacson was born shortly after Randolph Nelson died. Joe Keeton then decided to take Frances back 20 years before the birth of Margaret Benson, but she did not respond to any of the questions, even after trying many languages. Eventually they tried Swedish, and her face lit up. They asked her the name of a village or town using a Swedish translator and replied Halmstad, and she lived in the country. Halmstad is a city in the province of Halland on the Swedish west coast. She said she lived on a farm with horses. They asked her name and she said Anna Carlson. Her fluency in thought slowly improved as the conversation progressed. What is amazing about the last incarnation is that Frances Isaacson could not speak a word of Swedish.